And right, well, thank you all for turning up. Um, okay, so welcome to this webinar on navigating community-led place-based change in uncertain times. I'm Kate, I'm part of the Place Matters team, and I know we've got some people here who are old friends with Place Matters, but I know we've got quite a lot of new people as well. So if you're less familiar with our work, just to let you know, Place Matters, we're a UK-based charity that exists so that communities can change the things that matter most to them. And we do that by helping to connect practitioners, funders, policymakers, government at all levels, so that everyone can learn from each other, share with each other, and all of us play our part in making community-led change done well. So that's who we are. And I'm joined today by Emily Sun, who's founder and CEO of Place Matters, and she's going to be hosting our conversation today. And also with Avril McIntyre and Mark Cabaj as well. And Avril is the CEO of Community Resources. She lives in Barking and Dagenham and works in Barking and Dagenham, and has over 35 years experience across the voluntary sector. I was just catching as we started this conversation that started life as a social worker. Avril, I hadn't picked that up, so there you go. So there's a lot of experience there, and she's passionate about place, people, community-led change, and kind of brings real experience of just what's possible. And she's also a board member of Place Matters, which we're very grateful for. And we've also got Mark Cabaj with us, who is the president of From Here to There Consulting. And he's sat in Edmonton, Canada at 6 a.m. So Thank you, Mark, for getting up so bright and early to speak with us all here. And Mark helped found and build the Tamarack Institute for community engagement, which has been, I'm sure many people are familiar with, but has been at the forefront of thinking and practice on community-led change and collective impact for about the last 25 years, I think. And Mark is one of those people who kind of combines deep theoretical knowledge with real practical experience and the kind of ability to communicate that, and probably is best known for his ability to bring those things into kind of frameworks and tools and ideas that real people can use to do real work in the real world. So then we're going to have Emily, Mark and Avril in conversation in a moment. But before I hand over to Emily, just to say, we'll have the three of them in conversation for about 40 minutes or so. And then we'll have time for some Q&A. So if you've got some questions, feel free to chuck them in the chat. There's a question and answer box. I'm going to try and keep an eye on everything. So if you put them in the question and answer tab, I'll keep an eye on them in there. And then I'll feed them in once Avril, Mark and Emily have had a good chat together. So with that, I think that's me handing over to you, Emily. Is there anything else? No? Right, I will hand over to you and focus on pressing buttons. Anita, if you want to do your spotlighting piece, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Kate. And just wanted to add my own welcome to everybody for making the time to be with us on, I'm sure, a busy day, busy week for all of you. And it was great to see just how much interest there was in this topic. And I think many of you today know what it feels like to be living and working in communities right now. Things do feel a bit unsettled politically, economically, socially. Cost of living pressures haven't lifted. Trust between people and in institutions is thinner than what it used to be. And it feels like the pace of change just gets faster and faster than our sort of capacity to respond to it sometimes, and maybe even sometimes to understand it. So it does feel to many of us that we are living in a real time of transition. And it's a period where sort of the old ways of doing things are not working, but what replaces them is still to be shaped and being shaped. And it's both sometimes a very uncomfortable and overwhelming feeling, but we all know, I think, too, that transitions can also create new openings and new opportunities. And it does feel like, not just for Place Matters, but for many of the people that we speak to, like community-led place-based change is having a real moment right now, probably because a lot of people and institutions are realizing what communities have known all along, which is that community-led change is the most important unit of change. And this is where it's really happening. But we now see so much more philanthropy interest and funding behind looking at how does place-based change happen, how can communities be supported. And we're also seeing lots of things from government, the sort of English Devolution Community Empowerment Act recently, Pride in Place from which is going to be channeling funding into more than 284 places across the UK. The NHS is thinking about how does community and preventative health happen. And so there seems to be at this moment a lot of potential. Then there's this question about how can this work be done well, and how can communities really be supported in the way they need to be. And so just a definitional thing before we launch into the conversation with Avril and with Mark. When we talk about place-based change in this context, I think we're talking about sort of community-led place-based change, but where the communities are working in genuine collaboration with voluntary sector, public services, local government, employers, residents, of course, being at the center of that, but where people come together to work collaboratively for collective change is the kind of place-based work that we're talking about today, but we realize that there's lots and lots of good work happening in lots of places. So with that context, just wanted to tee up the three questions we wanted to frame our conversation with today. The first is the kind of why of place-based change, and why is it so suited to the challenges we're facing? And secondly, the question is, what does good collective action look like in a time of transition? Acknowledging that we are in a time of significant transition. And third, what role do funders and governments, what role can they play to really enable more of this kind of work to be happening across the country? So with those three questions, I can't think of a better conversation to be had with Mark and Avril to join us on that, given all of their background, their insights and experiences. So jumping into the first question then, about the why of place-based change. Mark, I wanted to just come to you first, because you've been thinking about collective impact, place-based change, different labels for essentially what we're talking about today across many countries. And you've done some writing recently about the whys of place-based change, and wondered whether you could share some of that with us.
Sure thing. And thank you, Emily, Avril, and Kate, for inviting me to participate in these conversations that you're having. Since I've been very young, and everyone on the call, thanks for joining in from wherever you are. I've been a kind of instinctual place-based change advocate ever since I was quite young, doing place-based work, and so love the topic. And because I love the topic, I know quite a bit about you folks at Place Matters. Number two, and I'm really interested in this topic about place-based change and uncertainty. So very good to speak with you and in front of others and take questions so we can sharpen our thinking about this, because we have to be the best we've ever been right now in these times. And to your question, Emily, about why of place-based change, there's lots of people who will give their own answers from their own experience. And there's a lot of really good research on this. I know that I was pressed to come up with my own when I was in Tasmania a couple of years ago, and someone asked me that question directly, and I went, oh boy, I have to reiterate that. But I have to reiterate it, the case, or make it visible in a way that is compelling to me. And the way I thought of doing that was to first say, well, there's some reasons not to pay attention to place-based change, because people are ready for that and they know the reasons, and it's not an unambiguous case for place-based change. So maybe we'll throw up a couple of slides here just to share with you my response to that answer, Emily. And by the way, my favorite philosopher is a British philosopher, Bertrand Russell, who says, or one of my favorites, I'm not willing to die for my beliefs because I might be wrong. And I feel this is directionally correct, these statements, but it deserves tightening and sharpening and debate, etc. So here's the way I answered that question, Emily. If we go to the next slide, Kate, that place-based efforts are often insufficient, but they're almost always necessary to make progress on tough issues. And so there's going to be two ideas I'm going to tease out here. What does it mean to be insufficient, and why is it necessary? So the case study that I'm going to refer to is actually one in Canada, and this is actually written up in a resource that we can share with people later in the PowerPoint, and even a link. It's called the case for community-led place-based change, 3 reasons to avoid it and 7 reasons why you can't. And it begins with this case study of ending homelessness in Medicine Hat, Alberta. And I won't go into the details, but Medicine Hat, Alberta is a very small city in the southeast part of my province. And it ended functional homelessness for a while. And functional homelessness meant that some people were homeless for a bit, but it wasn't very long. And they were in an apartment fast. And then they built a home even almost as fast. And part of that success, it was heralded quite a bit, but part of the success was left undissected. And so we wanted to find out a little bit more why. And we actually found out as far as homelessness goes, and that's only one complex problem, here were the 3 reasons that we should avoid trying to address homelessness in place and the 7 reasons why we couldn't. We go to the next slide. If you look at the reasons that people do not have access to affordable and homeful spaces to live, globalization is part of it. The global economic trends that are shaping the cost of living, everyone feels them now. My goodness, because of a war with Iran, we already have gas prices up, right? We're so interconnected with the world that if someone sneezes on the other part of the world or has a cold, we catch it too. So that's kind of obvious. Number 2, we actually do have declining civic infrastructure. I worked for the UN for a while, and one of the terms I heard there that was really useful was called civic density. And civic density is the number and the variety of locally valued institutions and institutional responses. So if a community has 17 clubs of this and 24 institutions of that, it's dense, right? There's lots of connectivity and capability going on. But some of that stuff has been cannibalized over the years, right? Organizations get bigger and merge. People are in place, but not community responsive. And so we all have our story about declining civic infrastructure. So it's harder to organize. And number 3, we have weakening social capital. So we don't know each other as well as we used to because of technology and transportation, et cetera. You know these stories. We might feel bad about one of the royals not having a good time, but we don't know that our neighbor is sick and in the hospital, right? Because we're stuck on our phone. So these are real reasons. And they're actually, I've experienced these doing community work. It's very tough. These things are in play. And then you think, man, I don't have the agency and the scope of action that I used to. But here are the 7 reasons in the case of homelessness that we knew, that we found that actually were a key essential part of that response and that success. Number 1, only in place can you customize responses to unique local contexts. Homelessness is homelessness in many cases, but it manifests differently in different contexts. Right? You have a lot of people on the call here. We could go through how the contextually different all those places are and why they require customized responses. Local action is the one people who, Canadian phrase, who know where the ice is thin on the lake. Number 2, complex issues have a lot of moving pieces. It's easier to weave them together in place. When you have big stovepipe or siloed types of organizations that have very impermeable walls, you can do a lot of weaving at the local level. Number 3, there's unbelievable untapped resources locally. If you look at the Medicine Hat case study, there was public funding, but you should see all the other types of resources that were added to the response that somehow appeared magically when people said, this is my community and here's how I can chip in. A lot of it was quite small, but it accumulates, it accretes quite dramatically. Number 3, there's actually lots of research on this. Ingenuity at the local level is higher. People can experiment more. It's way better, and I know you're going to talk about this, Avril, about real-time responses, right? You can move faster and at least in real time to crisis and change. There's a stick-to-itness at the local level that trends 3 or 4 year political cycles. We've got lots of stories of this. And the one that we're going to talk about a little bit later, place is where it's easiest to build social capital, both bonding social capital, which you've talked about, Emily, in her call, and bridging social capital. And social capital is one of the primary drivers or factors of quality of life. So that's a lot. That's probably the most I'll ever speak to a slide in this call. But this is sort of the balancing act, right? There are reasons not to do it, but it's extraordinarily difficult not to acknowledge and embrace and leverage and unleash the reasons it is useful to work at a place-based change. Now, one last thing, as good as it is, place-based change, we'll go to the next slide. that stuff in Medicine Hat did not happen only because of place. And we're going to come back to that later. It was part of a cross-scale response. There was an enormous amount of stuff happening at the local level. We'll call it a niche, at the niche level. And then at regional, provincial, and even federal levels, we have multiple levels of government here. There was an extraordinary amount of responses there that were quite coordinated across scales. We're going to finish with a bit of that with that information. And so if you look at a lot of these resources here, most of them say place is essential but insufficient. So we're really balancing this. We can't be romantic about top down nor bottom up. It really is about connecting the dots and untying the knots by cross-scale responses, but it cannot happen without place. In fact, why don't we go one more slide, Emily, because this is the last part of this. You like this slide. I like this slide. Avril, we haven't chatted. You may like this slide. I don't know. But the Giels level on sustainability transition, the one on the left is easier every one, and the one on the right is more complex. But it does confirm that things happen across scale. And at the local scale, some people call it a niche. And I think that's a good name. Right? Every community, every place is its own unique niche. There's some commonalities, but there's enough differences. And this local action this local dynamic interacts with upper levels and vice versa. The slide on the right is very crazy. We talked about this, and you don't have to read the words, everyone, but impressionistically, here's what it says, that if you want change, it happens because of the interaction of these dynamic forces over time, and transition happens when tipping points occur at these multiple scales together, and they're interacting to do that. So the diagram suggests that a lot of niche innovation will eventually, over time, tip a system. That's a lot.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That's all amazing stuff to get our heads around. And I think at this stage, it's really great to sort of hear that's not just about place, but it's also about how place works with different levels of the system. So here in regional combined authorities, but also places coming with other places and joining up to join networks and communities of practice. That's an incredibly powerful way for change to happen, and then also speak to the national system. So thank you so much for that. I think we're going to put the slides down for a moment, and I would love to bring in Avril here, because Avril, you have decades of experience on the ground, and in one community in particular where you can sort of say, how does this theory land with your experiences?
Yeah, so I think it's fascinating. So I've been in and around leading charities, particularly locally in Bark and Dagenham, for the last 25 years. And I think we started with a place focus, as in we can fix the place. We are the ones that can change this place, in the most arrogant and ridiculous way in those days of the Blair government, lots of money flowing, lots of things happening, lots of opportunity for voluntary sector innovation, to probably for the last 10 years, recognizing that to actually really talk about genuine place-based work, it has to be about the place. And we started to recognize that at a time when actually our local authority was very innovative and very visionary, the voluntary sector was actually fragmented and very insular and had stopped seeing the place. And we're actually focusing on our organisations, how you grow them, how you make them work, how they're the best for the resident. And a few different things happened for me that led me to go around talking to some of the local leaders who had power and influence and say, look, we're quite good at using that power and influence for our organisations. What would it look like if we came together to use that same power and influence to come together to change things for the place? And we started a thing called the Bark and Dagenham Collective. It became the council's infrastructure entity for the voluntary sector. And the focus of it was, what does it look like to find solutions together to actually tackle the stubborn issues that continue? Bark and Dagenham was amazingly good at every deprivation level and all the different tables across the country, really. But it was stubborn. It had been going on for, decades. What does it look like to change those things? And so that was really, we started in 2019, and it's been an ongoing journey since then to tackle how do you see a place changed? And the most fundamental thing in that was, but what does it look like for the residents? So there was a strong sense of powerlessness in residents in Barking and Dagenham. It was a very clear communication. Well, we can't change anything. Nothing is going to change. And the community around isn't changing. It's one of the fastest growing ethnic changing communities in the country still. But we can't actually make anything change. And so what started off as a voluntary sector movement has become, what does it look like for residents to start to really change things? And the challenges of that are, well, people really, wouldn't the world be amazing without people? If only everyone was like me. No. But it's that thing of how do we step down from competition? How do we stop looking after our own organizations? How do we stop lay down our solutions and actually listen to people and what their solutions are and what that looks like? So there was a huge opportunity at the time. Barking and Dagenham had a lot of investment in those kind of 2015, 18. We had a big disruption with a particular organisation that came in to do some work around resident thing, which was hugely disruptive and incredible, probably part of the catalyst and what brought change. The council were very open and willing. Lankelly Chase were one of their places, and that linked us up to the other Lankelly Chases. And it was an incredible, rich opportunity that we could have really missed. But actually, by coming together, we maximised the funding that was coming in and how to develop genuine social infrastructure that changes things. BD Barking and Dagenham Giving was set up, which is a place-based entity around funding. They got an endowment from the council. The council took a big, brave decision to fund a collective. So everything was very exciting in 2019. We were seeing huge change. And I'll talk a bit more about how it all went downhill from there now.
And that's the reason why you're here, Avril, to sort of, and I do appreciate the honesty around the difficulty of this work. It's not easy, and the bringing people together who have very different views and trying to get into collective action. We all know it just takes a lot longer. It takes a lot more relationship building than doing things unilaterally. But we also know that unilateral working is not an option anymore. It doesn't get those results. And I also appreciate that you're kind of naming the power dynamic sometimes between residents and even the community sector itself. Sometimes the community sector is great at bringing the agency and the voice of communities to the fore, and other times we're not so good at that as organizations or even as a sector. So how we're really honest about that and how we're really bringing that power to the residents is a really great question that you bring up. So thank you for that. We'll come back to hear the rest of the story. And so I just wanted to then move us on to the second part of this conversation, which is around collective action, place-based work, especially during a time of transition, when resources feel more scarce, when relationships can feel a bit more frayed, and there's more polarization in many of our communities we're facing it. I don't think that's just unique in the UK, but many countries are experiencing that. And does this whole idea about coming together to work collectively still hold when there's so many challenges? And how can we go through these times of transition to find new ways of working together collectively that's adapting to the current environment? And to help us think that through, I know, Mark, you suggested, which I thought was a great idea, the sort of adaptive cycle framework. And it's just sort of 5 minutes for us to sort of step back and see some patterns that are not just for here and now, but are age old, you could argue. And some of this framework was developed, the adaptation cycle, many of the audience will know, in the ecology and climate change field, but feels like it also has a lot of resonance for what we're talking about today. So can I take it back to Mark to take us through that framework, please?
Sure thing. And I'll actually tell you the story, the vignette that prompted me to think about using it again for a slightly different purpose, because I love that framework as well. I was working with an environmental group working on energy transition here. And this was a year and a half ago when it looked like we were going to get a government that was not remotely interested in climate change issues. And we were anticipating what our policy work would look like. And the title of our session was, what does good policy change look like in political winter? And we just said, because the context is going to change, but we still want to do good policy. And, someone in the group said, you can't grow tomatoes in Western Canada in February, right, when it's minus 20. But it doesn't mean you can't be a good gardener. And so what does a good gardener do in winter? And we were just playing with this idea about context matters a lot. So what do we do in a context that was either unfriendly or in transition? And that led us to a whole bunch of conversations where we kind of slip back into the adaptive cycle as a lens to look at where we are now. And so if we pull up the visuals, just show that a couple of diagrams again and remind ourselves of what the adaptive cycle reveals, and then use it to provoke ourselves to think about two different kinds of transition, one of which we don't like and one of which may be rough but is inevitable and we can manage. So, Kate, if we pull it up again quickly, if we were in an audience, I would ask how many of you know the adaptive cycle and to throw your hands up just to get a temperature check. But Emily, I think you said a lot of people do. The adaptive cycle, we'll go to the next couple of slides, is an ecological framework. And as with any ecological framework, it reveals certain things that are useful and it distorts and misses others. So we're just going to talk about what it reveals. And I want to put it alongside Meg Wheatley's two-loop model, which I also find quite interesting and reveals a lot of other things, but we're not going to spend time on that one. Take a look at the left, right? The left-hand curve is we'll go back just one maybe. Yeah, thank you. The left-hand curve is the dominant system that works for a while, and then it begins to decline, and we spend a lot of time hospicing it. As it's sort of on its way out, it doesn't function as well anymore. Concurrent to that is a new system that's emerging that has a lot of innovators working on things that get connected over time and eventually create the seeds of the new system. And then we have this transition period. That transition period actually is quite important, and I think that's where we are. I'm going to make the case for that shortly. The adaptive cycle provides another angle on it, which says all systems and societies go through different phases. And this is a universal, timeless process where these stages aren't always necessarily linear, but they're, directional, unidirectional, but the general gist of societal change and systems change is systems of maturity eventually go through something called release. And release is necessary to create the seeds for exploration of new alternative societies and systems, which then at one point, the more dominant ones begin to grow dramatically until they hit this maturity phase again. Think about technology, think about program models, think about justice systems, etc., even societies. This does reveal that kind of dynamic. Now, if we go to the next slide, we know that the active release often begins with something called creative destruction, a crisis of some sort. And this is a forest fire here. And of course, Emily and Avril and Kate, we know that forest fires are good and bad, right? They're bad because they destroy things. The upside of them is they're often required to trigger the renewal process. Certain seeds in Canadian forests need high temperatures to sprout, and they need open ecosystems to be able to create new alternatives, because the dominant systems are crowding out all the sunlight and energy and time and attention and resources. Those need to be released. If we go to the next slide, if we can just punch out the different diagrams. Creative destruction creates the release required for the next phase, which is growth and renewal. This is actually called exploitation in the Buzz-Hauling cycle, and we'll go one more, the maturity. Now, this phrase creative destruction is not all that nice for some people, and I've been told that we shouldn't use that much, so we're going to emphasize release. But the term creative destruction means the systems are released in a way where the nutrients and new ideas and relationships can express themselves in new ways. That's the idea of creative. If we go to the next slide, we also know that if the release process is delayed too long, And sorry, Kate, it's an awkward slide here, but maybe if we punch it a couple more, we'll see the notes here. We have something called catastrophic destruction. Now, if you see at the bottom right, Emily, Avril, that is forest fires in my province 2 years ago. That's a river to the left. The flames were so high that when helicopters flew over to drop water, the water evaporated. The temperatures are so high. That's catastrophic destruction. Catastrophic destruction is so severe that it wrecks the nutrients of the soil required for renewal. So I've been to California and seen places where the riverbanks don't even hold. The viscosity of the riverbanks has dissolved, right? So the nutrients, so there is no renewal because the seeds, the essential seeds, the ecosystem is burnt. If we go to the next slide, I think we have one more. Oh, no, sorry. We'll back up, Kate. We're rehearsing our slides, everyone. Here's the challenge. If we use this as a metaphor for systems, we are going through release right now. And the signs of that the transition are really clear. Weakening faith in existing institutions. They don't perform that well. Alternatives popping up, a kind of metaphysical grieving in a way, a lot of disorientation and uncertainty. We are in some ways really clearly in the beginning stages of release, if not midway through. It's hard to know. And that creates the uncertainty. The catastrophic destruction part of it could be, and things to avoid, and things that place can help avoid, is where the nutrients required for renewal, faith in each other, relationships, the ability to overcome polarization, the energy and the agency and hope to do something that matters, that you can see the effects of, to protect each other. All these things, if we don't pay attention to those, whatever comes on the other side of what we have now might be quite weak. And so place really is, and I'll stop here so we can interact a little bit. Place actually adds a whole bunch of options for ensuring that we go through a positive release and not such a negative release. And we can talk a bit more about that now.
Gosh, thank you, Mark. Actually, as you were going through that cycle, it reminded me of some of the experiences of communities during COVID, which was not only a transition, in many ways, it was kind of a shock for the system, and we all experienced it in different ways. But and very similarly to what you're saying, the communities that were the most resilient during that very difficult time were those that had relationships between different parts of the community and were able to be given the resources and the power to do things for themselves in the way that they knew had to be done for their communities. But also there was a lot of testing and adaptation. So it wasn't a programmatic thing. It was communities doing the things differently to try to meet the changing needs. And they would constantly come back and review, is this still working? What needs to change? So that ability to, now we call it test, learn, and grow a lot more in that we're using that terminology a lot, but there's a lot of test learning, adapting going on during that time as well. But the other thing that's come up in the research around COVID was the importance of social infrastructure, something that Avril's mentioned many times. So social infrastructure, even though it feels sometimes invisible, not just the places and spaces for people to gather, but also the relationships, the processes that bring diverse people together to do things together. That type of social infrastructure, where that was strong or existing, people were able to be way more resilient and responsive to community needs than where that was weaker. So really, a lot of things resonating for me as you're explaining that that framework. Avril, I'd love to come to you and sort of see what resonates for you from Barking and Dagenham angle. Sort of, what would you say that this phase of transition looks like for Barking and Dagenham? And, where do you feel you and the community are in terms of that adaptive cycle?
I mean, I think when I saw the adaptive cycle, and just in our prep actually for this session, I hadn't seen it before, and it gave me a lot of words for where we're at just now, because I think it's that sense of, I mean, I've been around for a very long time. Everything has changed in a way that I haven't seen for probably 40 years of my working life. It's things would change and then they go back again, but they're not going back. Everything has changed and they're not going back. And, funding opportunities have changed, resourcing has changed. We're seeing people shrink back. and basically work out how to keep the lights on. We're seeing friends whose organizations are collapsing and closing because they just can't manage anymore, and a real sense of loss. But and it's not I'm a pretty hopeful person, and it's not one of these things of, well, yeah, but we can still do it. We'll find another way, as I often have found myself doing. It's almost a very sober look at, we have to find another way because this matters too much. This place matters too much. These people around us matter too much, but we don't have an answer. And there was a really brave event we had just after Christmas. And it was the guy who organized it was an organization that was closing. They had to close, their funding had ended. And it was called We're Still Here. And in the end, there was about 30 of us. And to be honest, I really, really didn't want to go because I thought, oh, it's going to be a real mourning thing, how terrible everything is. I think it's terrible already. Do I really want to sit in a room and another 30 people tell me how terrible it is? It was the most interesting event we've had for a very long time that had been organized by the collective, which is now run by other people, not me. And it was a room, we did it that fish bowl style. And it was people basically saying the same thing. Everything has changed. So what do we do about it? And it wasn't big solutions. It was honest, genuine exploration of how do we do this? What in a time of destruction, and it feels like destruction, and people were talking about grief and loss, but in a time of destruction, what can come out of it in a really positive way? And it was one of these events that has shaped the conversation since, because it's about what can we do? And it isn't that there isn't any funding. There is funding. It's just we can't access it in the way we're used to accessing it. Funders have changed. And so what do we adapt together? How do we bring funding in? How do we create solutions that cause people to recognize what's changing? Everything has changed and we have to change. But I think what I heard in that meeting was there is a very different way. And we have to be the ones who adapt at this time. Or reality is there will be destruction. That's just a fact, for the sector, for businesses. And it's just, I guess it's left me with that sense of exploration. So there's a lot of talk here about social enterprise. There's a lot of talk about changing different models of how we do things. How do we do it together more? So interesting, a time when you're basically focused on keeping the lights on and there's less capacity to have a conversation. What we're finding is the social infrastructure that was built back in those, I guess, richer days or more abundant days is the very basis on which will enable us to help us survive. If they keep their focus, if the social infrastructure keeps the focus on facilitation, coordination, and bringing us together for solutions, at a time when I know for myself and my organization, we have less capacity than we did 10 years ago to be innovative. But innovation is critical. So yeah, it's a sobering time, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But something in it, we have to adapt, because if we don't,
Yeah.
what else is there?
Thank you, Avril. And I think there are some really great comments as well to say it's really important to acknowledge the mourning and the grief and acknowledge a closure of a phase that we were comfortable with or knew as we think about what's coming next. But
Yeah.
Mark, you were going to jump in there.
Yeah, I'm Avril. That's such a fractal, I think, your story of what a lot of other communities and groups are experiencing. And actually, I think we need to make those stories more visible because they're all over the place, and normalize them and sensitize people to them. I would maybe summarize from Avril's story and some of my own observations about this, which are early, that in that release, here's the challenge for communities. We actually have to keep the wheels on what still exists, right? Communities have to do that. Avril, you referred to that. And we have to invent new futures. And so the release phase, there's at least 3 clusters of work that represent good gardening in political winter, to use the metaphor. One is we do have to protect and resist and hospice and let go and reflect on the old system. And I'm a repressed East European immigrant kid, so I don't really manage emotions well, but I know they're there, and I've seen them. And so we really do have to hospice and grieve, etc. External transformation depends on internal transformation. That's so clear. And so that is real work that we have to make more visible and get better at. And it includes letting go of things. I was on a board of an organization where we were trying to come up with a new future, and everyone was saying we should stay alive. But you know what? Everyone was fulfilling our mission that wasn't fulfilled 30 years ago. And I thought, maybe we won. We were dealing with community safety. Everyone's doing community safety now. And we're here competing for resources. What if we let go and released all this energy to express itself in new ways? Time, energy, resources. So there's a whole thing about hospicing, doula, being a doula in the transition. Lots of good writing on this. I'm not going to contribute anything to it, but that's a cluster of work. Number two, when transitions happen, the space for innovation niches get really big. Right? Food, health, etc. Local action, that's where all the new stuff happens. That diagram showed that in the Giels model. I was in Poland from 89 to 94 doing restructuring in Eastern Europe after the wall came down. And most of the stuff was, we had a lot of top-down stuff on economic restructuring. Almost all the innovation was local. We were simply trying to keep up to the local because that's where it's faster, more visceral, etc. So number two, start building alternatives. Release in order to explore new opportunities. If there's no release, there's no renewal. If we hold on to old ideas, we're just going to reproduce the old patterns. So we do have to release, and we do have to invent. And the last one, which is the North, it's not just UK, it's North America, Emily. Polarization. Place is the play, is the arena in which you can reweave and reconnect with people. There's lots of examples of people overcoming polarization and distrust because they're connected to each other, right? And we could go into some of the research and stories about that, and I won't belabor the point because I know we're trying to be efficient with time. But those are the three reasons. Hospice and doula, the transition. Expand the niche innovation at the micro level to create new alternative futures, and connect and reweave like crazy on the relational side, because if we hate each other and can't talk to each other, there's no way we're going to live together.
Can I just come in there, Emily, a second? There was a situation last week where I had identified a big fund that we could potentially go for. And I was obviously thinking of saying, yeah, and we could do this or we could do that. And I was thinking of my own organization. And I was talking to the guys from BD Giving about how we could make an application. And as the time went on and as we started to shape the kind of concept of what we're applying for, I'm suddenly realizing none of this is relevant to my organization. Oh, damn. And Jerome from BD Giving said to me, but Avril, if we go this route, what do you get out of it? And it was one of these moments where I had to think, but the place gets a lot out of this. And there'll be something else that will, if we work this right, there'll be something else for my organization, as that's the way it works down the road. But there's something about, we have to live this thing. And what Mark's just been describing, the cold reality is it won't always be about my organization anymore. And there's something here that we, as those in the room, have to be willing to see the need of the place beyond the need of our organization. And that's a big deal. But it's vital to actually change something. And if it means we're not there tomorrow, then as Mark says, we might not need to be there. And these are hard things, but they are vital for the change that many of us have longed for. And that's why we do what we do.
And you might be there, and you will be there in a different form, in a sort of renewed form. But it reminds me, actually, what you're saying, which is so powerful, around of a visit that we made to Plymouth. And Rank Foundation had done some great work there to fund a collection of organizations coming together to work collaboratively. And they were looking at some initiatives around health and well-being within the community. And so they invited a large group of community organizations to come together with members of, the health system as well and local authority. And one of the community organization leaders said, when we first came to the table, it was all about me and my organization. And I had to wear my hat to represent and protect my organization. Now we come together and we ask ourselves, what is it that we can do for Plymouth? So this sort of I and my organization has transitioned to we and Plymouth. And it was such a wonderful, powerful thing. And it didn't happen overnight. It happened because there was that, to use a slightly boring term, the social infrastructure that brought them together. They were funded to come together, and they built the relationships that were necessary to be able to start thinking as a we rather than what am I getting out of this? So it feels really, really powerful. I do want to keep some time for questions, which I think there will be quite a few very interesting ones coming through. But just then to move to the next bit, and the last bit about what role can funders and governments at different levels play at this important time of transition? And we do know that there's a huge, much more intent within government, different all levels of government here in the UK, to really power up place-based work. So the intent is definitely there. How do we ensure that that intent translates to real impact for communities, with communities? So Mark, can I hand it back over to you to take us through, I think it was maybe one or two other sort of bits of framing, and then open it up for a conversation with Avril again.
Yeah, thank you. Again, there's lots written on this, so I think it really would be good to distill multiple sources of intelligence about what people are thinking on this topic. But my shorthand, the one that I can hold in my head, is three things. Number one, and you've already said it, Emily, it's essential social infrastructure at the local level, essential social infrastructure that is more than a delivery vehicle for the state. Or it's a Swiss Army knife of benefits. There's all those things that it can do. So when we look at that social infrastructure, you go, look at all the things this can do, those 7 attributes. And so we should pay attention to that. So it's not a delivery vehicle, it's more than that. Central social infrastructure that does multiple things. Number 2, I was thinking of the phrase reduce barriers, support, and design for engagement. And part of that is funding. Like engagement is the magical, the secret sauce of local action, I think, community-led action. But it has to be supported financially, which we already know. But it also has to be designed for. And I know that, we talked about this before the call, things like participatory budgeting, which is really great in the UK. Things like that is a wonderful expression of designing for engagement, fulfilling core functions in our world in a way that is participatory and engaging and inclusive. So that has to be designed. It just doesn't happen. We just can't default to delivery again. And including things like reducing barriers. Now, this is a Canadian example that may not resonate in the same way there, but here's a very simple, emblematic one. When you run an event in Western Canada, in most places, and you're on treaty country, you invite an Indigenous elder, to open up the ceremony with a prayer and some greetings, etc. And part of the ritual is you offer a gift of tobacco. Now, that is very easy to do, right? But if you're doing it with a government grant, you actually have to get an expense claim signed and formed, which is the absolute most insulting thing. You would never do that with an elder, ever, ever, ever. But that compliance tool, which is well-intended, et cetera, is such a misfire that we have had to and it wrecks the ceremony because an elder is not going to do it. We've had to work around it. And now it's been addressed in many public procurement processes. So it's just a little thing. So if we had an engagement lens on how do we reduce barriers, expand support, and design for authentic, inclusive engagement, that's screen number 2. That's just a design ethic, right? It's more than money. And the third thing is, maybe we can pull up the slide for this, actually comes back to the medicine hat example and actually says something about the role of organizations like Place Matters. And that is to design for cross-scale coordinated responses. And that, again, is a design thing. It's not just money, it's a design thing. So if we go to the very last slide, Kate, I think that we agreed to show, just as a visual of the, there we go. When you look at the medicine hat case study, it really was a story of connecting the dots and untying the knots at multiple scales. There's a lot of things going on horizontally at that scale, but there's a lot of vertical chatter and design and alignment work. And that connecting the dots and untying the knots, the central role there was intermediary organizations. They were the ones that did that. Everyone needs these processes, but the weaving together, if you will, or connecting dots and tying the knots, is done by actors at all levels being sensitive to it and agreeing to do it, but someone curates those spaces for that work to be more than the sum of the parts. And so places like Place Matters and others are quite essential to unleashing the civic infrastructure. So those three things: reinvest as a essential civic infrastructure. It's like a Swiss Army knife of benefits, designed for public engagement and designed for cross-scale response and coordination. Some old ideas, some new ones, nothing counterintuitive.
I like how everything's in threes, Mark. It makes it a bit easier to wrap my head around. But incredible words of wisdom. Avril, I've had some, really good and sometimes less good experiences with both funders and working with governments at different levels. And I remember you telling me that you really appreciated, I think it was Lankelly Chase, that you really appreciated working with them. And can you say a little bit more about how they worked with you, with community that, left an impression with you and that allowed you and the community to do the work that you needed to do?
Yeah, so Lankelly Chase invested, I think it was something like £2 million in Dagenham over a kind of 10-year period. And basically their criteria was, how do we create soil in which things can grow? And it really was the fundamental basis for how a really innovative social infrastructure started to evolve. So there was people who liked the story of why we started it, but then with that money, we could actually do it. And it really was the basis of, they funded the first person who was employed for BD Giving. At the time it was BD Renew. They funded our learning partner, they enabled learning. So a lot of what they funded has been our learning. And that was transformational and continues to be. We still have a pot of money that we've left over from the Lankelly days that now 20 residents are deciding how it's spent. It's really but it's really hard to get other funders to invest in that. And watching that journey for those 20 residents, it's just been incredible to see them deciding how it's done, why it's done. It's amazing. So I guess for me, one of the frustrations still with both government funding and other funding is they are behind the curve still. They're still got their criteria. They're still, I don't know if they think they know best or whatever, but it's that thing of they're stuck in a mindset of we need to be really accountable for this money, which of course they do. But what we find is when we put money in the hands of practitioners or residents, they are so accountable for it. If anything, they've struggled to spend it because they're so paranoid that they're going to get it wrong. And we just got to wake up to a changing world. To actually move the dial at the moment, money does have to be in the hands of those who are most affected by the issues. And that's probably our biggest frustration. So I think partly through the work of the colleagues that are now responsible for the social infrastructure entities, it's amazing to see them working really hard to create models to convince funders that this is the way forward. And we're very keen to join with others across the country who are also doing similar things to say, guys, wake up. Trust the people who are doing this stuff to decide how the money is spent. It won't be wasted. And I have not seen money wasted locally since, particularly Lankelly Chase trusted local people and local organisations to conclude it. And I don't see another route forward. And we're one of the pride and places. I mean, bless their hearts. I don't know how it's any different to the many, many millions of pounds that have been spent in the years I've known. I don't know what else will come of it because it's so structured and so specific. Put the money in the hands of the local places and let them decide how it's spent. I honestly believe we'd see change.
And I think, first of all, so much to think about there. I love this idea about funding to create the soil for things to grow. And so much of that is about creating the time and spaces for learning. We didn't talk about that as much, but when things are complex and complicated, learning and adaptation becomes even more important. So that's a lesson that I think we need to keep telling ourselves, because we get into the mode of doing so often. And then the second thing, I think it was really interesting to see that New Deal for communities, in some communities, it was absolutely transformative and sustainable, because that then led to other investments that even now are benefiting to the communities that received that funding. And a lot of that was because there was very good community agency around how that money investment was going to be spent. And other places where New Deal for Communities was great when the money lasted, but as soon as the money dried up, then there wasn't a whole lot to show for it at the community level. So I think the same thing is actually true of PIP. I think where Pride in Place is going to be a real partnership between the community, with the community agency and voice at the center of it, with local authority support, amazing things could happen. But where that doesn't happen, and it's a top-down exercise, you're absolutely right, Avril. It will be sort of same behaviors, perhaps, disguised as something else. So this is all to play, right? And how can we, as a collective, we really enable better place-based working to happen across the country? Working in partnership with local authorities and combined authorities and public services. Mark, you wanted to come in as well, I think.
Well, yeah, no, I what's that phrase? History doesn't always repeat, but it often rhymes. And I think this is a good conversation. We actually know, let's pretend, or let's hope we're going to get a renaissance of place making and place building. We should do it in a way that really pays attention to lessons learned. And, a little trick I learned in evaluation, a lesson hasn't been learned if it's not applied. Right? It's only learned if it's been applied. If it's just a lesson and not applied, it's not learned. And so we know a lot about stuff not to do. There's probably a whole bunch of things we still have to learn, but it would be like saying, let's not repeat some of these things, and let's start the next chapter on an even firmer footing. And I know one thing that just popped to mind, we have no idea about the investment patterns in the future, but if there is a new round of funding, I know that one of the lessons learned is something, particularly around funding in a time of crisis. Jane Jacob refers, do you know Jane Jacobs, the big urbanist? She was in Toronto for a while, Life and Death of Great American City. She was, I got to speak with her actually a little bit. It was another little story of how giddy I was as a little boy talking to a Zen master. But she, in our conversation, she talked about something called cataclysmic funding. And cataclysmic funding is the volume and the speed of funding is so great that it cannot be productively absorbed on the ground.
Wow.
It comes in like a storm. And we've all seen that. On one level, it looks really good. And another level, you go, it's overwhelming. I can't even account for this. And so there'll be pressures to do that. And that's just one of many lessons. So we like to say, we know there's a pressure to do it. Let's design our way out of this. And let's make different mistakes, not that one.
Yeah, I think that was one of the lovely things with the Lankelly thing, that thing of, we haven't spent all the money this year, it don't matter.
There you go.
And and even actually, since they've moved on, we've still got a pot of money that we're still spending slowly. That was our money. That is so releasing, so releasing.
Yeah. And you're right. We've seen where that money can become a distraction, when the purpose of coming together is how are we going to spend this money, rather than how are we going to build our place. That seems like a good place to end, although I'm sure, I would love to continue this conversation for many hours. But Kate, is it okay if we bring you back in to sort of see if there's any questions from our audience?
Hello. There's lots of questions from the audience. Just to say, I've been working in the international development sector for a long time, and there's a phrase for what you've just talked about, Mark, which is burn rate. And organisations would talk about their burn rate, an institutionalised idea about spending at speed. And if you can turn my video on, I can't actually at the moment. But I've got a few questions that I farmed out of the chat and out of the Q&A. So we're going to start with a question from Jemima, who is in Haringey, which is where I grew up, so there might be a bit of favouritism there. And Jemima's question is about, I think, Avril, it might start with you here, but a question about consultation with communities. And when there's a kind of both a desire and often sometimes a statutory requirement to consult with communities. But when communities then see nothing changing, people come in asking a load of questions, nothing changes, that actually becomes extractive rather than collaborative, and it actually erodes trust. And so it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on, again, how to manage that, how to resist that tension. That it's not, it isn't basically as simple or straightforward as just go and ask people, because if nothing changes, that in itself is destructive. So yeah, maybe start with you, Avril, and then I'm sure Mark.
Well, I think I would eradicate all community consultation. It's just such a nonsense. So I think what we're seeking to do is, where does residents are part of the design from the very beginning. And BD Giving have done some amazing work on this particularly. So with a £1 million endowment, local people decided how to invest that money, how to use that money. So we're seeking here to move from a model of let's consult the community to how do the community design everything that's happening. Now that takes a lot of work and a completely different approach and a completely different mindset, to be honest. So part of the thing across the board, and we're seeing it actually, with what they called neighbourhood health partners, that NHIP thing that's come in. It's really interesting. For the first time, there was a meeting the other week there where GPs were actually saying, it was so helpful having residents in the room. We're like, what? And I don't mean that unkindly to GPs, but in the past, they have not been keen on that locally. But then they're saying, like, no, this makes such a difference at the design phase. So we're seeing some really innovative practice here that is not a resident consultation. It's just a very different approach.
Mark, do you want to build on that at all, or we've got more?
Yeah, no. It's a very powerful response, Avril. I'm just thinking about that. I have the urge to make something as bold and to say that in those cases where consultation does matter, to say everyone get really clear here that what we don't want is performative work, and saying let's not pretend that that's not what could happen, to saying we're watching it. We do not, and what's real to expect from consultation. Often people just not only do they want an affirmation of the choice they may have already made, but they're not willing to handle the complexity of responses. And they say we're getting chaos back, and I'm going, no, you're getting complexity back. Yeah. Right? You're revealing the splatter of effects that your policy will generate and the diversity of opinions. You have to handle that. We have to get better at this and not pretend there's one single political will or a couple of them. And number three, I do think this is a role for intermediaries. We're involved in something now where the consultation wasn't good, and we are doing a third-party evaluation of the process of consultation, saying you did a bad job. It doesn't mean we're going to do it again, but let's just shine a light to this, that if and when consultation is required, we really want to show up and do the A game of it, not performative, and hold people's feet to the fire as well as our own.
Yeah.
And there's a great example of that I came across recently, speaking to Reach Foundation's work in early years in London. And what they said was that when they brought people from, health visitors or the healthcare system in to have consultations and conversations with the parents, they would always insist that they would come back, a few weeks, maybe a couple months down the road, to say what they did with that information. So it ended up becoming not just a one-off, but a dialogue and a relationship built over time.
Nice.
Right. Should we do another one, Emily? Shall I?
Yeah, great.
Okay. All right. Well, there's definitely some themes here, but this is a question that's come in from Nina Gilbert, and I didn't catch whereabouts you were, Nina, but so this question about power, and I've certainly seen this, that the narratives about community-led change can be a sort of co-opted version of how do we do more with less, and how do we sort of kind of tell communities they've got to sort it out themselves. But real community-led change is actually about shifting power in this work. So be interested just to hear kind of both of your reflections on how you make sure that this sort of work, community-led change work, is not just a proxy for the same work, but done by someone else, and is actually, how does the power shift actually happen in this work, and what do you watch out for where it kind of looks, it's actually performative? Don't know who wants to kick off with that one.
Mark, do you want, or I shall? Do you want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead, Avril. Thank you.
It's such a fine balance. And I think all I know is, and I can only kind of, it's not anecdotal, but it's the stories we're kind of living as an organization. But when someone recognizes their value and purpose in the community, that is the point when power can shift in a very natural way. I can't give someone power, but I can share any power I have or facilitate through the power I have to make that possible for someone else. And when you see somebody understand their value and purpose, it changes how they interact and what they want to do. And the bit we've got to be careful of is we don't say, yeah, but, well, because that person then starts to do something about it. They start to realize they have a purpose for someone else. They can change things. They can do something. And I don't ever want to rob someone of that. And I don't want to even start to excuse it in terms of, yeah, but somebody should be.
Oh, we lost you, Avril.
Just lost Avril's sound.
Can you hear me now?
We've got you back.
Okay, sorry. It's just, there's just something very powerful. And we can, and probably Mark's better at communicating this in a kind of broader global scale, but just an anecdotal was the thing I see that changes when someone realizes value and purpose is they have power. Mm-hmm. And they realize they can change something. And that's kind of the bit that matters to me in terms of, it's not one by one, but it's group by group. And if what happens is those people just start to do it, then I don't care if it becomes an unfunded. I think that's life and community that will change families and potentially generations.
Can I also add something? Kate, I think your mic might be picking up on some sounds there, but I just wanted to...
Pouring rain, sorry.
I wanted to add, I don't think I could say what Avril said any better, but it links this question with another one that's come through the Q&A about, is big local or community wealth fund a better way to bring money into communities than Pride in Place? And it's a really interesting question, actually. And many people have been thinking about the comparisons between these types of programs, for lack of a better word. And we actually do think there's actually a place for both types of working. Big Local was very much about money directly into community members' hands in order for them to be able to decide from beginning to end what they wanted to do within their communities. And they took lots of different approaches across the different communities that received that funding. And it was very much about building the grassroots ecosystem of community organizations and strengthening that. So there's an absolutely important part that the ecosystem of grassroots organizations play in the soil conditions, as Avril mentioned, or they're a key part of the social infrastructure. We see that Pride in Place is a slightly different way of working, which is also really, really important and brings a lot of potential. Larger pots of money, but this is now about partnership between community and local authority and public services and hopefully employers. So it's a much more sort of partnership approach, bringing together all the sectors that need to come together to change the system of the place. And it doesn't mean that the grassroots work doesn't need to be funded and isn't important. They're both critically important. But going back to Mark, sort of thinking about different levels of working, feels like Pride in Place is an opportunity to work across the system of place, but with that community voice at the center of that, but not working alone and bearing all the burden on them on their own, but working in partnership with everyone else playing the roles that they need to play, whether you're public services or local authorities.
Yeah, I'll maybe just add a riff on that. I really like that. I do think we need him. Avril, you started us off with this. I think we need a much broader understanding of power than our default definitions of it around formal authority and decision making. Not that that's not central, I'm not diminishing it, but particularly as mainstream institutions begin to lose credibility and don't function as well, there's lots of kinds of power, and it exceeds my grasp to even summarize this, but I've been learning that and watching smarter people than me talk about it. So much broader understanding of power. I'm also going to say that my own journey around DEI, and I know that language varies now and some people don't like it, has really been quite helpful. And for me, my shorthand is power can be adjusted and made more broad and inviting by diversity, which is representation of who's around, inclusion, meaning processes that are power-oriented and inclusive, and equity, meaning we're not going to pretend that's not a central concern in our conversations, and it's got to show up in our conversations. For me, it's about representation, process, and part of the understanding of what winning is. There's a lot more to say about that, but it's a central topic of our time. But I don't know if there's if we only need to be instructed by the past. In transition, power shows up in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
Okay. Emily, we've time for one more, do you think, or one or two more?
Is there one more question that we can take? And then I think we'll also then give back a little bit of time for everyone as well.
Okay.
Great.
Tell you what, there was a sort of good practical one here that Avril, you talked quite a lot about building civic infrastructure, and you said in a time of abundance. And there's a question here about sort of reflections on how do we build that civic infrastructure in a time of scarcity, which I think is now. So yeah, just wanted to be.
It's a huge question, and one that we're really facing locally, and I know other places are as well. And I think that's then comes back to the whole funding thing. We know there is funding around, so how do we make sure funding is directed to the soil rather than the stuff? And there's something very important here that we have got to convince funders about, which is about invest in the soil, and we will see then we will see things growing from that very root. And I don't think I'm being like, it can all happen, but there's something very fundamental that if we keep social infrastructure, particularly where it's not deliverable, but it's where it's about coordinating, it's about convening, it's about facilitating, then they have the time and the energy and the skills to attract other monies and other ways of doing things and upskilling people in terms of taking different approaches. So it's very tough. We're facing that reality here, but we do believe that money, dormant bank accounts, all that funding around, there's things that we haven't looked at in the past. We have to unleash some of that, and we have to have a good reason for people to invest in the social infrastructure of an area, of a place.
And we've seen some great examples as well around when funding, for example, is cut in one part of the system, people coming together and saying, this is being cut. In this case, it was about health visitors in the healthcare system not being cut back, but everyone in the community knew that was an essential part of the services and support for families. So a group of people from local authority, the local government, children's services, health, and communities came together to pool money to continue funding for the health visitors. So again, and it goes back to Nina's point, this is not about, how can community with even scarcer resources subsidize public services. Public services need to spend what they need to spend as well. But there's a quote that it brought to my mind, which was a social architect who said, it's not just about the amount of resources, it's often about the coordination of the resources that we have. So, and I think that is one lesson that Total Place taught us, which is there's a heck of a lot of money going into any place, but how is it being coordinated so that it's being spent in the way that is most useful and helpful and adapted to today's needs? So a lot to chew on there. But Kate, thank you so much for bringing the questions. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to both Avril and Mark for sharing just all that wisdom, all the insight, all the stories, and really appreciate you being with us. And Kate, there's a couple of follow-up things that we were promising, wasn't there, which I probably haven't remembered correctly.
That's all right, because you've been concentrating hard. So first off, thanks everyone there's been a lot going on in the chat actually, which I've been trying to follow along. We will send a follow-up email, we'll send you a recording so you can listen to it all again, but we'll pull out the links that have been shared by people in here and put those in the follow-up email. So if there's things in there, hopefully you'll get those. Thank you all for all the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. And if you have enjoyed the session, feel free to tell your friends, particularly the ones on LinkedIn. Give us a follow on LinkedIn. We're organising more of these events, and also we've got a weekly newsletter which sort of rounds up all things place-based. Feel free to send us stuff if you'd like us to share it through that as well. And yeah, just a big thank you to Avril and Mark and Emily for kind of managing all that big terrain. So I think that's all there. Yeah, that's all from us.
And thank you, Kate, and everyone for joining us. Take care, everyone.
Yeah, have good days. I hope the rain stops, unless you like the rain.